Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 24 of the Future of Work show. For those of you who've been following us through this year from June onwards, we've had so many conversations with amazing academics and practitioners from all over the world around what the future is going to look like and what are the trends that you and I should be concerned about because they're going to impact all our futures. For the past month or so, we've had a spotlight on HR, and we began with conversations around the future of human resources, moved on to a conversation around the future of performance management. And today, in my conversation with Rahul Verma, who is the Senior Managing Director of Accenture, we're going to continue that conversation on what the future of performance management looks like, seen through the lens of Accenture's own experience. If you enjoy conversations around the future of work, be sure to check out our website. We've got 23 other conversations there for you, and they cover a very wide expanse of topics, right from understanding how technology is going to impact all our lives, how will artificial intelligence, robotics, and other forms of technology impact the way we work, the way we lead, and the way our futures themselves unfold. So be sure to check out that series. And now for the topic of today. Let me bring on Rahul. Hi, Rahul. A very good morning to you.
Hi, Shalini. Thank you very much for having me here. It's lovely to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I know it's so early where you are. So that's a special thank you for waking up so early and joining us in our conversation today. Really, really thankful for it. I had the opportunity to hear you speak about Accenture's performance management experiment, change, transformation a couple of years back when you spoke at the Wharton School. And I thought this was a great time. It's been almost 2 years since to understand from you as someone who played a lead role in some of the transformation that took place then, but have now moved into a senior HR global leadership role and therefore have an experience of how the performance management system is playing out from the other side of it. I'd love to hear your experience of the whole Accenture transformation process. And what I'd like you to share with many of our viewers is, what was the early thinking that went into this transformation? What were some of the big changes that took place? And whether they actually panned out the way you'd expected, or were there surprises, and what you have learned since? Oh, that's a lot. Maybe that's a lot of questions I just realized.
Well, Shalini, fantastic to talk to you about this. This is a huge topic. It's central not just to human resources practitioners, but it's central to anybody that works in an organizational or a team setting or an institutional setting, whichever way humans gather for the pursuit of work. This is a very central conversation. So let me just share a little bit about how we got going on this. And it was about 5 years ago when our then CEO and Chairman Pierre Nanterme and our Chief Leadership and HR Officer Ellen Shook asked me to take a look at the future of performance management. And this was shortly after Ellen had taken on her role as our CHRO. And one of the things we did very early on was just a big just a listening exercise around the world, just to hear what was really on the minds of people. And one of the things that just came back in a resounding way around the world was that people had tremendous angst about performance management. It just came through, the rank and file, and regardless of culture or location or anything. And so that's when Ellen and Pierre asked me to start to think about, well, what could this look like? And it was also the time when a number of organizations were going at it. So this is about 5 years ago, to 2015. And as people were looking into this, we were seeing companies do different kinds of experiments. And so the most popular experiments were, well, let's just get rid of ratings. And one of the big questions that I started to focus on is, well, what is, in a sense, the purpose of performance management? Why does this matter? What are we focused on to really solve? And there were two ways of going about it. One was, well, let's fix what might be broken. And to do that, we would have looked at a performance management, 2.0, 3.0, whatever you call it. But as we kind of started our research, we called it a research sprint. So we said we're going to give ourselves 60 days to uncover universal truths that will inform the way we go. And so when we did that, we focused on a different question. And we said, well, managing performance is actually uninteresting to us. What we should really focus on is achieving performance at the individual level and collective level. And so when we did our research, we actually looked at organizations that had outperformed their industry over an extended period of time, 5 or 10 years, even predating the global financial crisis at that time. We looked at different fields of human endeavor. We looked at what creates great performance in sports, and in the arts, in the military, so many different areas. What can we learn from as the universal truths of performance? And what we uncovered then has been kind of foundational to our entire journey of performance, and we call them the universal truths of performance. And so, everything that I talk about is really based on kind of fundamental principles. And, you asked what has changed, what has stayed now that we're about 5 years into this journey. Well, quite a few things have changed. I mean, the pandemic changed a lot of how organizations just, manage performance. But the fundamental truths on which we've crafted the solution have kind of stayed the same. And I know I haven't kind of got into it, but I'll let you lead this conversation, Chalini, to what might be interesting for the audience.
Yeah. Thanks for the foundation, Rahul. So we've seen that, as you said, about 5 years ago, and maybe the earliest indications were perhaps a decade ago, that many organizations were starting to rethink the way performance management itself worked. And the conversation around this rethink itself took a few different strands, one of which was what you spoke about. Are ratings really that helpful? A second strand of conversation was around what's the cadence? Does an annual appraisal make sense, or is the world changing too fast? Do we need a different cadence? So, the conversation in many organizations moved to, should we have more frequent check-ins? Should we have more informal conversations? And I was wondering, for Accenture, which of these were really, foundational to the kinds of shifts that you made at Accenture? A third strand was, of course, the whole conversation around relative versus absolute performance. So, bell curve, no bell curve. And we saw after, I think, 20 years where the bell curve sort of ruled the conversation in performance management, starting about 5 or 7 years ago, it fell out of favor. So I was wondering, for Accenture, which were the big strands that you chose to focus on?
Yeah, and it's interesting when I hear you say this is taking my mind back to 5 years ago, and all the conversations I was having externally, internally, were really around these. And what I would kind of broadly classify these strands are the mechanics, right? So, should you do something more frequently or less, or should you have a rating, or should you have something else? If you don't have a rating, well, what do you do? And the bigger question is, what's the purpose of the rating itself? Why does it exist? And so why don't I kind of start with the principles on which we have crafted our solutions, and that'll lead to, therefore, why did we do what we did, and how it's gone from there. And so as I mentioned before, for us it was the pursuit of a singular question: what creates great performance, individually and collectively? What really does? And what we uncovered were 5 what we've since called universal truths of performance. And the first one is a simple one. Great performance happens when people do what they're great at and what they love to do, meaning that they bring their strengths and their passion, and they have the opportunity to apply that in their day-to-day work. Second, performance is certainly not in my company, and I would imagine many organizations, it's really not an individual sport. it is a team sport. It is, great performance happens when teams are highly engaged. And what creates highly engaged teams are when people within a team have aligned priorities, they complement each other's strengths and skills, and where there's a high trust equation. So you have to create the conditions for those to happen. Third, and this is where you touched, should you do check-ins, should you do this once a year conversation, and so on. And really, none of us, the way feedback I think has worked historically is I will sit you down once a year and tell you how you did. Now, in reality, none of us can improve our performance retrospectively, right? So it's really very unhelpful, for someone to tell me, well, remember that meeting that took place 3 months ago and you presented this way and, it went south and things didn't quite work out. Well, why didn't you tell me then? When you look at any sport, right, the sport occurs in the moment. It's very unhelpful for a coach to be telling somebody after the match is over, what they could have done differently. And so feedback matters if it is in the moment, not after the moment. And therefore, that's one of the kind of key principles of performance management. Now, there's a lot to uncover there. And it's one of the hardest parts of the journey any organization makes, is this whole kind of feedback thing. The next principle I would kind of talk about is the principle of ratings. And, one of the things we've uncovered is that there is no such thing as a bell curve. I think Jack Welch started it in GE decades ago, and I think it became, it got adopted everywhere else. But more recent research actually told us that organizational performance is more like a power curve than it is a bell curve, meaning that there are, in any period of time, let's say a year, there would be a small number of people that would have outperformed their expectations and would have out-delivered.
Yes.
Then there would be kind of a gradual slope with people kind of clustering at different levels of performance. And then there'll be a few people that actually missed their expectations and therefore underachieved, right? So that's how performance works. But there's no mathematics to this. There's no top X%, bottom Y%, and so on. But that's generally the curve. And so the bell curve and the ratings ought to go. But they ought to go for a different reason as well. One of the things that happens with ratings is we inadvertently or by design, what we end up doing is sticking a label on people's foreheads. And that label could be, well, you're a high performer, or you're average, or you're a below performer. And then that label takes a life of its own. That becomes identity. So if I'm a high performer this year, and you told me I'm a high performer this year, it's very hard for you to tell me next year that I'm not one, right? So there'll be a halo effect that'll just kind of carry through. And then if I'm a low performer, I might have been a low performer in a certain circumstance, or in a certain environment or a context, etc. But I'm left with that label, and it's going to stay with me, and it's going to impact not just my present but my future as well. And so, with great joy, one of the things that I had to get rid of was ratings and these labels. And so that brings me to the last principle, which is, well, so if it's not ratings, what is it? And we call them talent actions. So talent actions, going back to what creates great performance, it is not these labels, it's not these ratings, but it is forward-looking actions for people to grow. And so broadly, there could be 4 different kinds of actions that are kind of mutually exclusive but collectively exhaustive. So if somebody is outperforming at their role, the action for them is to get promoted or to take on a bigger role. If someone, and this could apply to many people, are doing very, very well at what they're doing, they still have to gain a few more skills or apply the skills in a different context. Well, then the action is to find those different projects or roles where they can continue to grow and learn. A third one would be that you come across people that might not have, might not be performing to their potential, but they've had a history of doing so. Well, that begets the question, well, what could create, what is coming in the way, what could create great performance? And you might learn that, somebody is not really applying their strengths or have the opportunity to apply their passions, or they may have been doing something far too long and are getting stale at what they're doing. There's no fresh thinking. But then the action is for them to change their role. And then the final action is, and this is a crucial one and very hard one for most organizations, including ours, which is, those people that do not have the right characteristics to succeed, not the right mindset, not the right skill set, not the right drive and focus. And the action for them would be to transition to a different organization where they can fulfill their potential. And so each of these actions, these are forward-looking actions, and they get specific and hyper-personalized to every person. That's what creates high performance. So, what I just talked through, these 5 principles have really been our solution. And there are many aspects to the solution. That's what we call, and so therefore we got rid of performance management and we call it performance achievement. Exactly.
Rahul, I really like the fact that you defined the question, fairly sharply, that how do we create great performance? And all that you spoke about, the research you did around, what does it take to help people be better at what they do, and, looking at sports and other fields as well. So I want to ask you, did you sense that there would be a tension between the kind of performance management or achievement, in your case, performance achievement practices that build great performance, and the kind of practices you need for things like rewards and compensation, where, there's a more fixed buy? One of the reasons why we're having this conversation is that in part 1 of this series, we spoke about this sort of tension between one of the big objectives of performance management, which is to help people do better at what they do. And as you said, one of the big insights which many organizations had was that while they were good at evaluating people, the traditional performance appraisal didn't really help people be better at what they did, because, as you said, for all the right reasons, it's, once a year, what are you going to do? It's too far out in the future or in the past. Good performance needs immediate feedback. It needs personalization. It needs, not labeling people. But then these are exactly the kinds of things that are really helpful when you have like fixed rewards or, compensation decisions. So I'm wondering if you experienced a sort of tension between the two big objectives.
sort of tension would be the understatement of the decade. Of course there's a tension. I mean, this is the central point. And imagine, at that time we were about 375,000 people strong. When people learned that we were going to get rid of performance management, when they learned, ratings were going to go away, the reaction followed a bit of a bell curve, pun unintended. But the reaction was like, the moment this news came out, there's this euphoria of, wow, no ratings, you're never going to have ratings, and that was incredible. And then, it went the other side and it plummeted. And when we announced it, we hadn't even created the solution. There's a whole different story of how this came out in the world at a time I was least expecting it, in a manner I was least expecting it. But when it just came out, after the euphoria, then the question in everybody's mind was, well, if you're not going to have ratings, how are we going to get paid? And this is the biggest shackle. This is the biggest reasons why I have seen, and I've talked to many CHROs and my peers and others around this, where it is extraordinarily hard for people to do what we did, which is essentially blow up performance management. So I was saying, well, goes back to the question. If you want to be in the business of achieving performance, you can't live with your existing performance management system. Why do I say that? Because every time the question comes back to the central one of, well, what about ratings? If we don't have ratings, how will we pay our people? And I remember, this was before I moved to New York, as we were doing our research, we were holed up in a tiny conference room in the Manhattan office over here. And after all the research was pointing us to where we had to go, we literally found ourselves handcuffed because we couldn't get there, because we couldn't figure out an alternative to the rating. And so I remember actually drawing a picture of a dog on the whiteboard. And the analogy that I had in my head, the visual I had in my head, was that the rewards tail was wagging the performance dog. And so what if you were to delink the two? What if you were to snip the rewards from from performance? What might it look like? And the moment we gave ourselves that freedom, that led us to actually explore and see what could work. And so what is it? Well, so rewards decisions are actually far less complicated than we think they are. For the most part, we're making two decisions on every single human being. What is their base pay and what is their bonus? Organizations have equity. Well, there may be a third decision around equity, which applies to a smaller, more senior kind of level in the organization. I can come to that if that matters. So base pay. Well, base pay has very, very little to do with performance. It has everything to do with the market. So if you pay someone less than what their market is, they're likely to go away. You're likely to not be able to attract people into those roles because you're underpaying. And so there's enough and more intelligence that we can gather about what the right base pay ought to be for different kinds of roles, for different kinds of levels across the organization, across countries, everywhere. You have a lot of insight on that. So base pay has very little to do with performance, can be managed. And then the second question is bonus. How do we determine somebody's bonus if we don't have a rating? Well, that's where you go back to Josh Berson's discovery of the power curve, which is small number of people making a disproportionate impact, clusters of people, around different levels of performance, few people that miss their impact. So how should you be thinking of bonus? Well, those people that have outperformed their expectations, and the results can be measured n number of ways, sales, revenues, and there's just n number of ways, whatever industry you're in. Well, those that did it for this period of time ought to be given a disproportionate amount of bonus. You ought not to stick a label on their head to say, you outperformed. It's just that the conditions were optimal for you to really outperform whatever was expected of you, and therefore you ought to get a disproportionate amount of the bonus. At different levels of performance, you apply human judgment and say, well, based on the different levels of performance, you would have different levels of bonus. And then there are people that miss their expectation. Well, if you missed your expectation, you ought not to get a bonus, because then it would be a gift. So when you come at it with objectivity and clarity, you remove this, sticking of labels on people's foreheads, then these decisions become much easier to make. And we've been doing them for 5 years now. So, anybody that says, well, it can't work, it has. And, and the last thing I would say is, this is not about something that you can actually put on a PowerPoint and put a flow diagram and say, this is how performance management works. One of the big realizations I had was that, what I'm just talking about here is undoing decades of wiring in our own brains. You and I went to the same school. But regardless, we grow up from a very early stage being graded and having our identities associated with grade. And that grade then determines where we go to next and what we do next and so on. And so when you say we're not going to have ratings, it's a very fundamental rewiring of the brain. If not rating, then what is my identity? How will I progress and so on? And so you have to. This is about. It gets to practicing those behaviors and those practices individually and collectively, and over time we get good at this, and over time this becomes the norm.
That's beautiful, Rahul. I love the emphasis you had on the rewiring the moment you remove labels and you look at performance in a period without labeling. It's a beautiful philosophy. I can just about imagine how difficult it would be to implement in practice, because, as you said, it was against the way we have operated since we were in school. And we're so accustomed to labels that sort of define our potential sometimes, our performance, that doing away with labels, would have been an extremely difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around. Any surprises, Rahul, when you introduced this? Things you expected would go one way, but in fact went another?
My biggest surprise was when we were introducing this. I had expected, based on how much we had heard around the world of how people hated performance management, including me. Therefore, I was really delighted to be given this opportunity to do something about it. And at that time, I'd been working for about 20 years, and for me, there wasn't another aspect of my work life that I hated more than performance management. So my thinking was, or my expectation was, that the moment we would show and reveal a new way of being, which was based on fundamental truths and science, and which would be uplifting and inspiring for our people, I thought that people would just gravitate to it right away. And that didn't happen. And that was the biggest surprise for me, because the process of introducing the change was in orders of magnitude harder than I thought it would be.
I can imagine. I think you would have had to face exactly these kinds of questions. Okay, then how will the process be objective? How will it be transparent? How will our rewards work? Will people trust that we've done justice to their performance, etc., etc.? So I can just about imagine how difficult that would have been.
Yeah.
5 years on, are there any shifts that Accenture's made to?
Yeah. I mean, they're just we keep adjusting, and we keep evolving. There is no solution I've ever come across that works the way it was intended to, or is as effective as it is to. So there've been many adjustments that keep occurring along the way. So, for instance, in the mechanics, there's an evolution. There are things that don't get taken up the way you expect them to. One of the fundamental conditions of performance is focus. And so, in service of focus, what we actually did was we did away with objectives, and we introduced the idea of priorities. And the whole, intent behind this is that for any person to achieve optimal performance, you need to be focused on no more than 3 to 5 things. When people are used to a long list of objectives and KPIs and so on. So, we've been adjusting our approaches. We've seen, it hard for people to embrace that mindset initially. Then there are times when, your business gets highly impacted, like, we saw in the pandemic just now, where the world got turned upside down, and we had to take, whole industries were collapsing around us. And so we had to manage our workforce. And so, you adjust the mechanics as you go. So there are things that we've adjusted, the things that we've learned about, things that have taken us a lot more practice and time and investment to get right over time. Things that we are still working on. For example, we're still working on feedback 5 years in. Hardest thing to get right. My friend David Rock, who's not too far from me here in New York, he and I have met multiple times. We've done experiments. Very, very hard to get right. Real-time feedback. So there are adjustments there, and there's an evolution, I think, that'll keep happening.
I can imagine. I think what we've been seeing over this last decade is such a big series of shifts, which organizations such as yours and many other really well-known organizations, perhaps starting in the world of technology and then moving to consulting, have sort of experimented with, because the traditional performance appraisal system was just not helping, not in the way that senior leaders wanted it to, and even HR leaders wanted it, which was that people should be able to perform better. So with all those limitations, we've seen such gigantic changes, and yet our fundamental wiring around evaluation is very, very strong, besides the fact that, there is this whole problem of rewards and compensation and bonus, which has been so strongly linked with performance appraisal for decades that simply untying it the way you spoke about at Accenture would have been, an extremely complex exercise in practice, just people accepting that. So Rahul, I'm going to take a few comments. Abha, hi Abha, nice to see you here. Great insights into performance management. Really like the conversation around what individuals enjoy what they do. So, do you find that the new performance achievement process, I think that's the term you use, right? Does that help people gravitate towards roles that they would enjoy better?
I really think so. And the reason I say that is this. After we implemented our first cycle of performance achievement, one of the things that we heard, again, a surprise, I wasn't expecting to hear that, from our leaders around the world, was that they found this to be a hugely valuable experience. So I don't know how many people on the show relate to what I'm about to say. So my experience every year used to be, we would get together into a room in what I would politely term as a dogfight over who gets in the top 20, who gets in the next 25, and so on and so forth. And really the last category would be, absolutely horrific, to nail. And so what used to be a yearly dogfight and a highly kind of defensive, confrontational exercise, soul-destroying experience. The moment the ratings went, the moment forcing people into boxes and labels went away, then the conversations entirely changed. So people would come into these conversations, and they do today de rigueur, and the conversations are uplifting because if I have to represent my person, I come and say, well, let me tell you about their impact. Here's what they did. Here's what was expected of them to do, and so this is their impact. And then these are the person's passions, these are the person's experiences, these are the person's aspirations. And then 5 people start to chime in, well, how about we consider this for that person? And maybe I can mentor this individual. Or somebody will say, well, I think there's this other role, why don't you talk to this person? And that's what I meant by hyper-personalized actions. These are not theoretical actions, these are actual actions for people to grow. And so that's what's that's what's come about since then. And so what we've heard back from our senior leaders is, for the very first time, we've actually got to know our own people, even those we've worked with for years. We realized we didn't know them because we would talk about them, in terms of what label they'd get. But now we really understand them, and we're able to help people achieve what their own aspirations are. And it's not to say that hard conversations don't take place. I mean, they do, and they need to. And no system makes those hard conversations easy. None that I know of. But yeah, I mean that's part of what you have to do through this. But for the most part, I think yes, people are more fulfilled through this experience.
Very nice to hear you say that, Rahul, because there is this whole conversation around personalization of employee experience, not treating people simply as numbers, but as the whole individuals that they are, and using technology to give us enough data points to enable us to do that in a manner that is helpful for everyone. So really happy to hear you share your experience of how this worked out in practice at Accenture. HP, nice conversation. Thanks, HP, for joining. Shabnam, forward-looking actions, great concept in performance management. Vikesh, hi Vikesh. Thanks, Shalini, interesting conversation. Thanks, Papia. How do you take care of skills and development in performance management? And I guess that will be the last question we'll be able to take. So I know you have to rush to another meeting.
Yeah, long and really critical topic. So I'll give the very short version to this. Performance and learning are two sides of the same coin. This is something that I think I've had a deep belief around, and our organization has a deep belief around. So how do we take care of skills? We are an organization of over 500,000 people. For us to be able to take care of skills, first we need to be able to understand skills. So one of the things I did before I came into my current role is we had a massive project called Specialization at Scale. And what that really did was using artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to glean information from many different data sources within the organization to understand at a granular level what skills people had. Now that's fundamental because, one of the things probably the pandemic has accelerated most starkly is the digital transformation of organizations and the movement to cloud and so on. And I think what would have happened perhaps over a decade is going to happen over 2 years, which means people's jobs are going to radically change. Organizations' focus are going to radically change, which means people need new skills and they need to be constantly learning where they do. So how do you guide them to the right skills? How do you guide them to the right learning? Well, you need to have a strong understanding of that. And then when you have discussions about people, the actions of what they need to learn, and learning is not just going and taking online classes, or learning is part of that happens. You get awareness through learning, through a medium, but then you have to practice learning to get good at what you do. You have to go from awareness to being a practitioner, to being an expert, to being a guru. That's a long journey. And so one of the things we do de rigueur over the years is, we have more than $1 billion that we invest in learning of our people. And good times, bad times, hard times is just a continuous focus. And so I guess the short answer therefore is, first of all, you got to really understand the skills of your people. Two, performance discussions have to focus on what people have and what they need. And then you have to have the investments, the infrastructure, the capabilities to be able to pivot your people to where they have to go through learning, through on-the-job, training and work and so on, and through different experiences.
Lovely answer, Rahul. So, one of the things, there are 2 or 3 big points I'm taking away from our conversation as we come to the end of this. One, the fact that, a lot of the driver of the change which Accenture rolled out, and perhaps many other like-minded organizations have rolled out, has been around the question of what is it that we can do to aid performance. So in the sense, the question itself has been different from the primary question which has driven performance management in the past, which has been how do we allocate rewards. So that's the first point. The second is this whole idea of the human or the whole individual, rather than sort of a reductionist idea of limiting the individual to a label or a rating. And that seems to have been a driver philosophically in many of the things that you've spoken about. And the third is about using performance management or performance achievement to both drive better performance, but also give a very personalized path ahead to each individual, and whether that path is in terms of what they need to do to enhance their skills, or what's the journey ahead of them, and using data technology to aid some of those conversations. So those are the big ideas that I'm taking away from our conversation. Is there something else you'd like to add?
Thank you for asking, Shalini. There's just one thing that I would add to everything that you've so wonderfully summarized. This takes leadership. It takes serious commitment, conviction, and leadership. And one of the things I have told many of my HR peers that have been trying to do something about this issue is that this is not an HR issue. If we come at it as an HR issue, we'll never make the breakthrough that we need to. And I'm immensely grateful to our late chairman and CEO Pierre Nanterme and the leadership of our chief leadership and HR officer Ellen Shook, who actually had the conviction and the clarity to blow up something at the scale that we have. For a $40 billion enterprise with very, very large number of people. This takes leadership. It takes, because like I said, you can't tinker with it at the edges. If you have to do something, it is so fundamental, it's so revolutionary that that it takes leadership. And so therefore, if anybody's kind of contemplating these things, I would say start with the business end of this and really understand how, what is the appetite to unlock great business performance. And then, the mechanics will be unique to every different organization. They can't be, what works in Accenture is not going to apply the same way elsewhere. The principles do, but the mechanics don't. And so that's the only other thing I would add, which is bold leadership.
Oh, that's lovely, because that makes perfect sense. I mean, performance management has been such a backbone of all HR and organizational systems and as you said, it's not something that you can tinker around at the edges. The kind of transformation that, you've been speaking about, and which perhaps many organizations are contemplating, if they haven't already progressed along that, are so fundamental that they really get to the root of, what are we here for? What are we having these conversations for? Is there a shift in the way we look at people? Is there a shift in the way we think about them? So they are fundamentally transformative, both in their intent and their outcome. So I realize we're at the end of our time, Rahul. Thank you so much. This was really, really helpful. I hope for anyone who's listening to us, if you enjoyed our conversation, check out Uncube's website. We have 23 other such conversations, including the part 1 to this conversation today, the Performance Management Revolution, where we've interviewed Professor Anna Tavis of NYU. With that, we come to an end of our conversation today, and this was the last conversation of 2020. Join us in 2021, actually Jan 21st, 2021, with Professor Mauro Guillen, who has written the book 2030, a professor at Wharton, and he's going to speak about his understanding of how the future is going to unfold for all of us. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Do keep listening to our conversation and have a wonderful new year. See you all next year.